access case studies. I've got two really great experts here on this topic. First up is Monica Webb, Head of Market Development and Strategic Partnerships at Ting Internet. And of course, Ben Lewis Ramirez, the co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Lit Communities. Welcome to both of you. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So I encourage people to come in with questions and everything. But the open access has been kind of it's a concept that's been around for a long time, but it seems like it's gaining some more momentum in recent years as folks want to have better internet in their towns. But so let's start off with open access. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of talk about this concept internationally, and even remember the cable networks trying to do this. But maybe you can have each of you kind of define, how you look at open access and the value of such networks in a community. I guess Monica, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Ben. Yeah.
Sure. What would I say? Two Cows in our internet business, we've utilized different models, including build, own, and operate our own fiber networks, as well as partnerships where we lease some fiber from a municipality as a middle mile, and also where we provide service on top of fiber to the home network owned by public or private entities. We're involved in two networks where it's they will become open access, but we've had a head start as the first initial provider, as well as another network where there are two providers competing for the launch of the network. So that's really where our open access experience has been concentrated. And, I think that what I would say, and, me personally, I came before I worked at Ting, and I've worked there since 2014. I was involved in a municipal effort where we looked very deeply into both open access as well as models where we would partner with a retail ISP and where we would be a retail ISP. So I feel like I've had broad exposure to the, sort of the pros and cons of open access and how they impact financial models. So I'm somewhat agnostic in what I think of that. But what I would say is open access financially it does have some risks to it that are not necessarily relevant if you have a private model. It's open access is more of a policy goal, and generally that's why it's well suited to municipalities. And I would generally urge municipalities to ask themselves what is underlying that. And I think what I've heard and what I've seen, and even from my own perspective, is that there has been bad experience with cable and telco monopolies, where they haven't given great service to customers, and there's desire for better service. There's also a belief that competition lowers prices. And what I would say to that is, with respect to service, you may get better service with open access, you may not. And the reason that is it takes a lot of capital to build the networks, and when it comes to actually competing open access, prices do go down. So that is definitely a plus for residential customers. However, the margins for the ISPs can also be narrower, and sometimes service can be impacted. So that is a reality. So if you're looking, from a municipal perspective, if you want multiple providers, you want multiple options, open access is certainly a model that will give you that. And in terms of the actual service you're going to get, it really comes down to the individual providers. So what I recommend to municipalities that are looking at this is make sure you vet the providers, make sure you have standards for the providers that you're looking at bringing on board, if this is what you're looking at. If you're looking at partnering with a private infrastructure builder, ask them who their providers are and research their providers. I think those are really the important things to keep in mind, because both municipalities and private sector providers, when it comes to the enormous capital required to build those networks, are going to have certain financial needs that need to be met. They're going to have certain risk tolerances. And open access is a great goal, but do recognize that it comes with an additional layer of financial risk than it does if it's a single provider model.
Great. Ben, how about you? I mean, with communities.
Sure. So I agree with a lot of what Monica said. Our own interest in open access comes from the consulting work that we've done over the past several years with, underserved municipalities. And there's a sort of prevalent mindset, especially in rural communities, that the municipal government has no business competing against the private sector if there's an incumbent internet service provider, even if that cable company or telco has done historically a poor job of customer care and service quality. Very often municipal leadership will be squeamish about competing, against the private sector. And so open access can be a sort of silver bullet in situations like that, where the municipality can position itself as, rather than creating competition for the incumbent providers, they're sort of enabling a higher degree of competition. That's certainly, in theory, you do run into issues with service provider quality. And everything Monica said is certainly true when it comes to the importance of making sure that the quality of service will be good. An interesting thing that seems to be the case in most places that we have looked is that internal churn on some of the more established open access networks is relatively low. And we think that's because once a customer switches from, say, a DSL or a cable connection to a fiber to the home connection, that the difference in experience between being connected to a fiber network versus being connected to one of these legacy telco networks is so stark that that they're essentially pleased and happy and don't see a need to switch. And so this kind of race to the bottom price wars that are, theoretically possible, we don't really see that happening very much. And so to us, and kind of the position that we have come sort of evolved into, is, the economics for a private company of building open access last mile infrastructure is difficult, because you're assuming, a large percentage of the risk of that investment, and you're having to give away significant portions of revenue to the ISPs who don't have skin in the game when it comes to the capital expenditure to build the network. But where we see significant value for open access is in the municipal space. So not only in a situation where a municipality is interested in supporting a last mile build, and there are certainly successful examples of that, it doesn't necessarily take the flavor of an open access situation where the consumer is able to switch from one provider to another. If you take, for example, Breckenridge, Colorado, where the town took on the expense of building the infrastructure because private companies were struggling to make a business case to do so, and then they brought in a provider to deliver services over the top of the infrastructure that they own and operate. So those types of situations, I think, we will see more of that as time goes on, and then also open access middle mile infrastructure. And we've seen that be successful in a number of places around the country as well, where really the goal of the open access infrastructure and of those municipalities is to lower the bar, lower the threshold for a private company to make an investment into building that last mile infrastructure. If you take away, the capital expense of the middle mile, it becomes much easier for private companies to make the case to enter into a community that otherwise would not have been attractive to them. And so I think that in the United States, at least, we will sort of see those types of models a lot more commonly than, say, in Scandinavia, where you have wide adoption of privately owned open access networks. And there are pockets of that happening here in the States. But from an investment standpoint, it's a little bit more difficult to make the case for a model like that, when you sort of have these existing functional models that work. So, for example, for us, the first market that we're building out is Medina, Ohio, and where there is a publicly owned middle mile infrastructure that is open access, and we're able to lease capacity from that network to build last mile. And we are open to other applications. I think that one thing that we have sort of gotten into the mold of thinking, as an industry, of a fiber to the home as essentially being internet service, but there's obviously many more connectivity dependent services that fiber can enable. And you talk about like telehealth and smart home automation and phone lines and those kinds of things. So I think the other model that you will see become more common and that we are using is, we are an ISP. However, we're providing phone service via third party. We'll have telehealth via third party, and so on. And so there will be a sort of marketplace that our customers can pick and choose a la carte services from some other providers. But when it comes to internet, that'll strictly come from us in this first market. We may choose to open that up to other providers, and every market is different. So there could be places that we build in the future where we don't go in as the only ISP, and then in the municipal space, on the consulting side of our business, it's still a model that we advocate for.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on something both of you said. I think Monica said this first about quality of service, and how do you overcome that, and how does on an open access network, how do you help, if there are multiple ISPs, how can you overcome the QoS sort of conundrum or kind of issue? How can people kind of ensure that the customers are getting good quality service on one of these networks? How can we do that?
I will follow on to what Ben said was just the fact that it's fiber, it's going to be a much better product experience for the customer anyway. So there's, you're already eliminating a lot of the complaints which were service related as a result. However, when it comes to actual support, that's where we do hear some of the complaints from some of the open access networks, is that customers, when they do have an issue, have a hard time getting a hold of the ISP, or the ISP doesn't necessarily respond to them, et cetera. So it really is something that does need to be addressed proactively. There need to be standards put in place by any municipality that's looking to do an open access network. And, and also in the case where a municipality is looking to partner with an infrastructure provider that says they're going to bring multiple ISPs. You also want to have standards there that pass through. And also, I would say that you're able to vet who those providers are going to be. I think that's incredibly important.
Sure. Ben, how about you? What are you seeing in your experience with Medina and other? I know you have a lot of different projects going on, but
certainly. So essentially, if you're bringing an ISP onto your network, that ISP is the face of your business as well. And so, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where your service provider is incapable of, living up to the standards that you've set for your own business operations. and your customer interactions and so on. And so, for us, a big part of that is just making sure that the companies that we've looked at are large enough. They're well enough staffed to handle, some of their own marketing, some of their own customer care, their own CSRs, drop installations, maintenance, all of that kind of stuff, versus say, a real, because, the situation that you want to avoid is like having the bar so low that anybody could kind of create an ISP in their garage, and then not have the capability to provide sort of end-to-end support for customers, and then that obviously reflects poorly on your network. There's a consumer education a component to this, and people here in the States are not used to the idea that the infrastructure that they get their internet from is neutral, and that the provider is a separate company. For most people, they don't even necessarily think about what the infrastructure is, and so you just really don't want to put yourself in a situation where a company that has lesser standards than you is the one that people associate with your business.
Right. Ben, I want to follow up on something that a really great point you talked about, and I've talked to other communities about this too. In New Hampshire, they're trying to do this up in northern New Hampshire, build middle mile networks as like kind of an enabler, as you just said. I mean, talk to us a little bit about that, a little bit more, expand on that. You finding that's a good entry point for maybe some communities to kind of build that infrastructure, and some rural parts of New Hampshire that are going to start doing this, I think, next year. There's some coalition. That's just an example, but it sounds
sure.
interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This type of infrastructure is expensive, and there's an enormous cost difference between building middle mile infrastructure and building last mile infrastructure. Last mile obviously being enormously more expensive. And so, politically, it can be difficult to get an expensive infrastructure project greenlit, especially if this is an environment where the community itself and the political leaders within the community don't want to enter into competition with the private sector. So there's, a few things that kind of make it more attractive. And, we sort of view the middle mile infrastructure on the sort of, if you build it, they will come type model. We've worked with a number of communities who are in very rural parts of their states, where they're not necessarily good connectivity available to them. So even if they wanted to build a last mile project, they wouldn't be able to reap the full benefits of it because they don't have sufficient backhaul to a data center. And so we would also, like, you've got the kind of municipal level middle mile infrastructure, which really helps bring in private investment from the outside, and then kind of a step beyond that, region-wide middle mile infrastructure, which is in the example of Medina County, what they have. So Medina County has middle mile infrastructure passing through each of the towns and cities in the county. And that makes the lift to build those, much easier. So the first two communities that we're building in Medina County are two of the smaller towns. And we're doing that, for a number of reasons, partially to prove the feasibility of it. Our motto is it's always feasible. But the reason that we're able to start in those smaller, less attractive, traditionally less attractive communities for a private company to go build is because, we have the middle mile infrastructure in place, and it's easy for us to get onto that network and expand.
Monica, how about you? I mean, is Ting seeing that in some of the communities that you're serving, with people wanting to get that middle mile together as well, and
Yeah, I think I would agree with Ben that middle mile tends to be more relevant in areas where that you have significant expanses between communities. So predominantly rural, where there aren't a lot of other options. I think by its nature, it's sort of replacing what we would find as backhaul in more urban areas. So it does, of course, have to be open access just to make that model work for middle mile. But I completely concur with what Ben just said, which is that the vast majority of the cost is in the last mile. And so for rural areas, to undertake, to say, oh, if you do the middle mile, it offsets the cost for last mile. Not really. It's really more about needing robust connections out of the communities to the internet. That's what the middle mile will facilitate, which you would be paying for in an urban or suburban area. There just would be more prevalent options. So it's really about, I would say, filling a gap as opposed to defraying a cost for doing a middle mile. So just as important, but not necessarily a financial incentive for a last mile provider.
Okay, interesting. Another thing that we were seeing, and you guys are both touching upon, is the notion of the public-private partnership. Do you see that as a key element to drive more just getting fiber access networks? I mean, there's communities that are, banding together. We've talked to some folks in Maine, like I mentioned, New Hampshire, people just kind of getting together and saying, maybe we'll come to Ting or we'll go to Ben or another provider and say, look, we want to build a fiber network. How can you help us? I mean, how do you see those playing out? I know it's kind of become a big concept that we keep hearing more and more about, but I'd like to get both your reactions. Yeah, Monica, I guess we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, as somebody who lived for 14 years in rural Massachusetts with no connectivity, and and eventually, I was one of the founders of a movement there, and we passed legislation and authorized funding to get a fiber network built. It really is important, particularly in areas that are that have been chronically unserved and underserved, for them to take a proactive stance on getting connectivity. And, with respect to the technologies out there, I think the case is finally closed that fiber is the best option. If municipalities are going to allocate money, do it right, do it once, and do it with fiber, as opposed to, trying these other hybrid solutions that have, for years been said, oh, but it's cheaper. It's not in the long run. So definitely, I think it's important for these municipalities to be proactive, particularly if they're unserved or underserved. I would say, with respect to public-private partnerships, and just I would say municipal networks more generally, especially if they're in rural areas, especially if they want open access, that they're probably going to require some, particularly rural plus open access, they're going to require some ongoing taxpayer support, or at least support for longer than it would if it was a municipal retail, or if it was a private sector only solution. And just that expectation is there up front, that you are conservative in your financial modeling, and that communities are very prudent when they execute on the design and build of these networks. Because what we have seen is that, and this is not my personal experience, in Western Massachusetts, but what I have seen elsewhere is that municipalities often get into it. It's obviously not their area of expertise, and there is a lot of money given away to overbuilding a network for that particular area. So I would just say prudence is required, and expectation that there may be some ongoing taxpayer requirements for, certainly, obviously there is in getting the debt initially, but also with respect to the early operations of the network, and maybe even for ongoing operations.
And how about you? What is the community seeing kind of on the field?
Certainly. So, I mean, we believe that public-private partnerships are incredibly important, and the sort of beauty of them is that there's no one-size-fits-all PPP that's ideal for every place. And the exact nature of that deal can take many different forms, but it's important. We feel at LIT that it's important for the municipality to have some level of skin in the game if nothing else, to incentivize them to make it easier for you in your deployment. So like, for example, um, making sure that the network is engineered with capacity to support a variety of smart city applications that the municipality might want to implement. Making sure that you have a fiber access point and spare fibers in the network itself, dropped off at each, say, traffic intersection so that they can connect their traffic lights. Those kinds of things, will also go a long way towards smoothing out the relationship between the private and public sectors. Another kind of simple way that a municipality might put some skin in the game, and sort of a light version of a PPP, would be, allowing for expedited permitting. Providing off-duty police to perform traffic control versus having to submit traffic control plans through the city engineer. If the community owns its own electric utility, providing a simplified make-ready process to, again, expedite the deployment. And those are things that, in our experience so far, have been very helpful. It's like, okay, well, we will offer you this, and in exchange, we would like this. And, and it's mutually beneficial. So a PPP doesn't necessarily have to be like, the municipality bonding, or helping with the capital expense. It can, and there's obviously some high profile success stories that would fall into that category. And I'd point back, for example, to Breckenridge, where they couldn't get a private provider to come build last mile, so they built it themselves, and then they offered it up to whoever was going to give them the best deal. So I'd say public-private partnerships are crucial to bridging the digital divide in this country, but that there's no one-size-fits-all that type of partnership should take.
You mentioned make ready. I mean, how are you guys navigating that? I know it's it could be a very thorny sort of issue depending on the town, depending on the utilities. And I mean, I guess, Ben, since you mentioned, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Monica. But how do you guys navigate that whole thing? And of course, there's the OTMR.
Are you going to the pool? All right. When I get back, I might come out.
So, we got some. Okay, so that's a great question, and I have a good example. I won't name names, but there's two towns in Medina County. One of whom gave us a lot of leeway in the make ready department. Very reasonable pole attachment fees. Blanket permitting permissions, the ability to perform some of our own make-ready construction, those kinds of things. And then there's another community in the county who didn't want to do any of those things and wanted to charge a significantly higher pole attachment fee, and was not willing to be flexible at all in the permitting or make-ready steps of the process. And so we're just not building there. I mean, we will eventually, but they're much lower on the priority list as a result. So that's a very concrete example of how a public-private partnership can work, and how not having it in place, makes it untenable for the private company.
Monica, how about you? I know you've navigated through that in Western Mass, and of course now with Ting and Virginia and everywhere else. But yeah, what are you guys seeing? I guess so many different flavors.
Yeah, and as Ben alluded to, any municipality that owns their own pole stock, if they have a muni electric, that's a huge benefit to any municipal network, or if they're undertaking a private partnership, because that can greatly facilitate the make ready process. I would say that my experience in the New England, in Massachusetts, we looked actually to the example, interestingly, there, Connecticut and Massachusetts and a few other New England states have a municipal gain area on the poles. that is dedicated for municipal use. It was supposed to be only for municipal alarm use. Connecticut managed to get some regulation enacted that allowed, municipal networks to take advantage of that. I know it was challenged at one point, and I'm not sure the outcome there. We did try that initially in Massachusetts as well, and it wasn't well supported by the legislature. But that's not to say that was probably 10 years ago. I think there's more appetite for that now. So if you're in a New England state where there is a municipal gain on poles, there might be an opportunity for a legislative or regulatory solution to access that space. That's unique to those states. I would say from Ting's perspective, we're only aerial in Charlottesville. We definitely believe in the long-term resiliency of going underground, and also the predictability of build that goes along with the schedule of building underground versus aerially. I have been intimately involved with our work at Charlottesville from an aerial perspective, and it's tough. It's really something that is tough to navigate from an administrative standpoint, meaning the logistics of it. Right. There can be bureaucracy tied up in it. There are long timelines. The strategies to mitigate, any timelines that aren't met are very difficult, and in some cases hard to enact. It's a lot of relationship management. So it's One Touch Make Ready certainly streamlines it in theory quite a bit. It's I think the challenge is going to be getting all of the pole owners on a similar system and with competence in administering OTMR that is really going to determine its long-term success.
Great. Well, both of you, Ben, you mentioned this. I mean, talking about working with communities and providing open access fiber networks in general. I mean, what kind of community do to sort of attract you? I mean, to come to their town or their city. I mean, when they, because a lot of these people that maybe want to build networks don't know much about it. You maybe get a mayor that wants to provide better internet, but he doesn't know how to go about it. And what makes an attractive community to you guys, to go there? I mean, is it the openness? I mean, you're willing to cooperate on different things? I don't know. How does that work?
That's a great question, Sean. There's a number of factors that play into that. The political will is arguably the most important. Having a local champion with some decision-making power in the community is really important. And we've gotten a lot farther in places where we had that versus places where we didn't. And then there's all kinds of other factors that might go into it. Like, we've talked a little bit about the existence of a municipal electric utility. That might be, below political will, the single most important piece. They're sort of already familiar with the process of placing a wired utility on a pole line, and managing all of that. They can also typically make it, a lot easier for you versus a market where the pole lines might be owned by a competitor. Things like that. And then there's all kinds of other considerations, proximity to transport, to a transport network. So like, we worked with one community in Texas that was, there was a single fiber coming in that fed a wireless tower, for cellular service. But that was it. And there was no, it would have been very expensive to try and build, middle mile just to get to them. And so, in communities like that, our consulting process is more geared into how to get connectivity to the community itself versus how to get connectivity to the residents of that community. And then there's all kinds of other factors like density, climate,
right,
all sorts of stuff. we have this whole process we call fit for lit that we run communities through before we go to them.
Monica, how about you? I know, like during our events and conversation I've had with you before, I mean, you talked about kind of how communities work with you and how they become attractive, I guess, to Ting to kind of come and work with you. And I know other people have expressed similar views, but what are you seeing, you know, when you talk to communities, any different themes?
Sure. You know, well, we like to go through open doors. So certainly, you know, any city that, you know, and generally we do find that cities that are proactive on this issue have, you know, generally understand the, you know, what they need to bring to the table, what they could bring to the table, what it means for their communities to have a ubiquitous fiber network. So generally we find that the proactive communities know that it's, you know, the spirit of collaboration is important. But specifically what we look for, you know, is if we're building that there are going to be elements of build facilitation. And by that, I mean, you know, streamlined permitting, openness to microtrenching deployment, providing data that is going to help us build the network and sell subscribers, general support and enthusiasm from staff and elected officials. And then if, you know, in any legal agreements that have to be done, that there is a very clear process, that it is an efficient process, that we're all working towards getting those done in a manner that is that is as expeditious as possible, and that creates terms that work for both parties. And I would say that also applies if we're doing any kind of public-private partnership. We'd want to make sure that you know, the terms work for both parties. We're not looking to do so, like, I think when any time we embark on a public-private partnership, or even we've done some private-private partnerships, we're really looking for both partners to win, because that's the success story. It's not a success story if we make out like bandits and the other partner doesn't. So, you know, that's something that is important to us in the success of any, you know, working with cities if we're looking at a public-private partnership. And then I think lastly, it's any assets that they can bring to the table that can help. You know, do they have a fiber backbone that's already built, that we could potentially lease? Do they have co-location facilities? Do they have connections for transport? Do they have land if we need a central office? So all of those things are definitely great things that cities can think about in advance and bring to the table for a productive discussion.
Okay. Well, there's a question that Drew kind of posed here about ownership of the asset. Is that best handled publicly or by the individual homeowners or by the private sector network operator, whether it be Ting or Consolidated or someone else? Monica, what do you think of that? And I'll ask Ben after, but yeah.
Sure. When you say ownership of the asset, do you mean the overall network generally?
Yeah, the overall network. Yeah.
You know, I think it's going to, you know, I think, you know, Jill Schumacher, who recently came on board at Ting, as she likes to say, you know, will solve the, you know, fiberization of America with every different model that's out there, right? So there's space for every different model. I would say with Ting, we do like to build as much of the network as possible because we like to control the operation, because that is so fundamental to the customer experience. Now, that being said, we also, as I said, what can expedite our build is if the city already has a great backbone that, you know, touches every neighborhood.
Right.
In their community, that can really expedite things. So in that case, the municipality would own part of the network and we would lease it. And, you know, we look at the leasing again as everything, you know, what are terms that work for both parties when we look to arrange that. So I don't know that I would say there's an absolute one size fits all model, but I would say that, you know, generally we absolutely look to ideally own the network, but we are absolutely open to partnering in all different flavors, from the municipality owning the whole thing to just owning a ring that we lease from.
Right. Ben, how about you? What kind of models are you seeing?
Sure. So, I think from the perspective of most ISPs, they're going to want to have as much control as possible and as much visibility into what's happening in the network as possible, so that they can respond as quickly as possible to any issues that come up, outages or physical damage that occurs or anything of that nature. Now, having said that, to echo a bit of what Monica said, every place is different, and the forces at play and the all of the variables that come into deployment of a new network. And so, situations where there's a municipally owned or a county owned middle mile, and we would build last mile are certainly common, and I'm sure we will see a lot of that. Having said that, we are theoretically open to being an ISP on a completely third party owned infrastructure, whether that is privately owned or publicly owned. In some ways doesn't matter, as long as the provider has sufficient confidence in the quality of the plant and the electronics that underpin it. I don't know that ownership of the actual asset really makes all that much of a difference. It is I think where things get complicated is just because of the magnitude of the investment required to build last mile infrastructure. It's, you don't want to take that expense on as a private provider and then hand it off to somebody else. So if we're taking the expense, like, we will own and operate it. If someone else has taken that expense, but the network meets our standards, we don't have a problem with that either.
Great. Another interesting question that just came in. Can cities put fiber in the same trench as their water and or sewer lines? We've seen some talk about some of these things as a community I talked to a while back. I don't know, I can pose that to both of you. I guess, Ben, I'll ask you, have you seen anything like that, or any, is that kind of...
Sure. So can you ask that question again?
Sure. The question was, can cities put fiber in the same trench as their water and or sewer lines? Like,
yeah, like
I've heard there was some interesting technology I heard that some folks in England did, and there was a community.
Yeah. So there's I mean, the short answer is yes. And there's some very interesting things. You mentioned a British company. I'm sure we're thinking of the same one that's got a product that can be deployed through water lines. And there's some very interesting benefits that you can gain from that when it comes to leak detection and flow monitoring and all sorts of things that are potentially of enormous interest to water utilities, who in many cases are monitoring aging plant, and they don't necessarily know where the weaknesses are. And so, yes. However, it's a difficult lift. As I understand it, the United States has some of the most stringent requirements in the world when it comes to what physically touches our potable water supply. So there's some hurdles to be overcome before something like that becomes really widespread. I believe that they've done some pilot projects on the West Coast. I want to say Washington State, and possibly something down in California. So yeah, I mean, I would expect to see that kind of thing gain prominence over time as the viability of it is proven. And when it comes to sharing trench with other utilities in a greenfield environment, I mean, that's obviously ideal. If they're going to open the ground to place water and gas lines, why not lay some conduit for fiber as well? And so that's something that we have pushed with a lot of the communities that we've done consulting work with, is helping them to implement dig once policies, so that if if a street needs to be opened for utility work, that the contractor has a requirement to place empty conduit on behalf of the municipality. And then the municipality can do with it whatever they like. They can use that, in a sort of PPP offering to make the deployment of a private network cheaper and easier. They can use it to lay their own fiber. They can lease it. There's all kinds of things that become possible with an asset like that. So, where you run into problems is regulations and engineering requirements and those sorts of things. But given the high capital cost of deploying fiber networks, my assumption is that we'll see creative deployment strategies like running fiber through water pipes, become more common.
Yeah. Monica, how about you? I'll kick it over to you. I mean, you have a very diverse set of communities you're serving. I'm just wondering, you guys.
Sure. And I'll preface it by saying I'm not an engineer. So, I'm really going to be just repeating sort of, what I've seen
Sure.
and heard. We're certainly not pursuing locating in, water or sewer lines now. I do know, where I live in Toronto, I do know that there are fiber lines in the sewer system, but not necessarily in the sewer lines though.
Sure.
I would say, locating within the actual lines, as Ben mentioned, that might benefit the water and sewer authorities in terms of monitoring that particular infrastructure. Is it the best location for a fiber network that is serving the wider populace to locate? That is somewhat debatable. You have to exit those. You have to exit the distribution lines regularly. And so there's that question of a secure exit to each customer that you're serving, or to at least to each handhold that can become a challenge, as well as any kind of repair and maintenance of either set of infrastructure becomes challenging. I would say with respect to locating in a trench where there's water and sewer, generally there are stated clearances between telecom facilities and any wet utilities in the municipalities that we've seen in greenfields. Usually they're looking for dry utilities to be located together in a trench. So that would be electric and telecommunications in an open trench, a shared trench environment. So I certainly haven't seen it. I do know that, as Ben alluded to, water and sewer are very protective about their particular asset. And
Right.
That's why I think those clearances exist. And of course, I'm not an engineer, but I'm not sure that there is a viable path currently to them coexisting closely together in deployment in the U.S.
Yeah, it was just one community we saw doing something like that. It was kind of interesting, but interesting. This kind of leads me into another question here. One of the things I think about when I think about fiber going into communities, it's like a ripple, So, I mean, you get great fast internet service to consumers, but it can be an economic development tool to attract businesses, keep younger people in the towns, and I mean, also maybe, just my favorite story is from the FBA conference in December about the sandwich machine being direct connected to a fiber network, and a business wanting to come to a town because they had fiber there. I mean, do you guys agree that it again, fiber is this kind of outlier thing that can attract other types of uses, I guess, in a town, and smart city stuff too, I guess, but I don't know. See what you guys think of that.
Yeah, I think at this point, the economic benefits of a community connected to fiber versus one that isn't are pretty clear and well understood. I think what will be interesting, when you have an environment where there might only be one town out of 10 that has fiber, I mean, that's obviously going to draw investment into that community and will prevent brain drain in that community and those sorts of things. I think it's interesting to think about what that will mean or how that's going to look when all 10 of those communities have a fiber connection. And there's so the economic benefit, I feel like, there's diminishing returns. The more bridges we build across the digital divide, the less kind of impact that might have, because you've got a larger pool of connected communities. We're a long way away from that being a factor, and at this point, I think for the immediate future, the economic benefits are significant and fairly well understood.
Monica, back to you. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's been a lot of studies around the economic development benefits of having fiber there. I think with, any large city, the ability for a business to get fiber generally exists. It's really when you get into smaller cities and towns, and where it can be a differentiating factor for them. And I would say particularly important now post pandemic, or from the pandemic, as people are looking to move out of cities and live and work remotely, fiber existence becomes an important location decision maker. So you will see, because as population growth can stimulate local economic development. So some of those places that are are affordable and great places to live and raise a family that also have fiber are probably going to be beneficiaries of this population transition versus those that don't have fiber.
Okay. This is a question for both of you guys. I mean, when you guys enter a community where there could be an incumbent cable or telco, I mean, how do you see these companies reacting to you coming in and building fiber in those towns? And do they react with lower prices or trying to battle you in some other way? I know things are different now than they were 20 years ago, but we always heard those classic stories of the telco trying to sue everybody. But I don't know, just curious, how do they react? I guess Monica, I'll start with you and then go to Ben. Yeah.
Sure. And every town we've gone into, there's been an incumbent cable and telco serving people. Varying levels of service when we first started going into these towns from the cable perspective, and that really is a game changer, because we went in with gigabit before any of the cable companies were able to offer that. So in some of the towns that we're in, they've upgraded the DOCSIS facilities so that they can do download gigabit, but it's still not fiber. So I would say generally, I wouldn't say that in those particular localities that their upgrade was especially motivated by us being there, their network upgrade. But I would say they more focused, certainly in the near term, on pricing and messaging. So it was, we've got a gigabit too, so then it was up to us to nuance the difference between symmetrical gigabit over fiber versus a gigabit over a cable plant, and also short-term pricing and locking people into contracts. So we really saw those as the immediate short-term reactions, was messaging, locking people into contracts with in short-term promotional pricing differences.
Okay, Ben, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing all of that also, and we've also seen some, dirty, underhanded tricks on the construction side. We've been reported, we have been coloring within the lines and following all of the permit regulations and all of that, but we've had one of our competitors repeatedly report us for supposed violations in an attempt to slow down our build. And then we have one provider in a small portion of the footprint here that has started building some fiber to the home. So, for us, coming from this philosophical background of just wanting to bring connectivity to as many people as possible, I mean, that's great. If our activity caused them to build some of their own fiber to the home and better serve some of their customers, and that's fantastic. There's a lot of pie out there in terms of people who are connected via antiquated technology. So I think an incumbent reaction is sort of inevitable, but if it results in better service, even though we're not financially benefiting from that, the community is. So we see that as an overall win.
And I should probably add that in one of the states, one of our earlier states, that an incumbent did go to the state legislature and get to preclude the form of public-private partnership that we had initially done, which was a long-term IRU with the city of their backbone fiber, did go to the legislature to preclude that from happening in the future with other municipalities in that state. So certainly you may see some of that, but it didn't really have huge long-term impacts for us.
Great. I think we're kind of running out of time, but if you guys want to just quickly give some final thoughts, and then I'll hand it over to Drew, I guess, who wants to have a few words. But Monica, start with you, and then to Ben. Just any final thoughts?
I would just say that for municipalities that are listening to this call, I think if they're starting out, which is often, this is sort of where they start out, find out everything you can about the ways that your municipality can get connected, be it just from attracting a private sector provider to come to your municipality and build, and how can you make that an easy path for them, or provide them with an open door, as I mentioned earlier, to, if you really want, you have the political will to finance and build a system, how to make that happen. I can say that's not an easy path. I did that in rural Western Massachusetts, where we didn't have cable service in my town. All we had was, maximum 3 megabit download DSL. It's still a tough path. You will still get opposition from many expected and even unexpected places. And so it's not to be underestimated if you want to do it from a municipal perspective. And so learn about what's been done, follow the case studies, look at the providers that are out there, and most importantly, be in touch with your local stakeholders and what they want and what they're willing to do, and make sure that you bring them along with the effort as you undertake it. And also, if you want to, anyone that wants to reach out to me, if you want to talk to me, or if you need help with any further resources, I think you'll probably provide that contact info at the end.
Great. Thanks, Monica. And then Ben, just quick, we'll wrap up here.
Sure. So yeah, I'll try and be brief. I've been a long time supporter of open access. Firmly believe that from the consumer perspective, it's the best model. And I also firmly believe that it's a key tool in the toolbox that we'll need to bridge the digital divide everywhere. I think that if you are a municipality and you're evaluating your options, you owe it to yourself to consider some form of open access. There's been some discussion in the chat about how the role of government should be, lowering barriers to private sector investment versus competing with the private sector. And to me, that's open access in a nutshell. You lower the barrier, you make it as easy as possible for a private provider to come in and offer service. And you do it without stepping on the toes of incumbent providers by offering them a place on the network if they want it. To my knowledge, no incumbent provider has ever agreed to that, but that doesn't mean it won't happen one day. As Monica said, I dropped my email in the chat. If anyone has questions or wants to talk to me about any of this, please reach out. I'll be happy to.
Thanks, Ben. And off to Drew.
Oh, wonderful. Sean and Monica and Ben, I want to thank you very, very much. But before we officially thank you, I want to just say a couple of words. And Ben's point about there's been some discussion in the chat is probably the understatement of the week. There's been a lot of loud shouting in the chat room that's gone on parallel to this discussion, of course. And we could go on and on and on this topic, and we do plan to. In fact, I want to call your attention to one of the reasons we're doing this series this month is in preparation for the Broadband Communities Summit and our Digital Infrastructure Investment mini conference at Broadband Community Summit, September 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th of this year in Houston, and DII, the Digital Infrastructure Investment, will be online as well. We encourage you to go to broadbandbreakfast.com/join. I put that in to learn more about our offer to join as members of the Broadband Breakfast Club. We have sponsors, and we're very grateful for our sponsors. They include Utopia Fiber, Positron Access, STL Network Services, and Samsung Electronics America. Thank you to those organizations for your support of Broadband Breakfast. And we now have introduced membership of the Broadband Breakfast Club. And you can learn all about it at that last link I posted, broadbandbreakfast.com/join. For a limited time, we're offering $49 a month to become a member. You'll receive exclusive features and columns. The column we sent out to our members just last Friday was on open access networks and some of the different models that we're seeing in open access networks. We will be launching members only webcasts like this one in a few weeks. And we also offer invites, discounts, including for our members, discounts for the upcoming Broadband Community Summit. So with that, I want to call your attention to our event next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, which will be on roads, bridges, and broadband, how physical infrastructure impacts digital infrastructure, and our event a week from then on June 30th, real estate, 5G, and digital real estate investment trusts. With that, on behalf of Sean Buckley, Monica Webb, Ben Lewis Ramirez, thank you so much for being a part of this program. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you, everyone.
Yep.
All right. Make sure to stop the streaming.